This is an oral history interview with Cherry L. Emerson, a friend of Georgia Tech, conducted by Barbara Alexander on April 30th, 1996, at his home in Atlanta, Georgia. The subject of this interview is Mr. Emerson's life and his connections with Georgia Tech. So if you would, Mr. Emerson, please begin at the beginning.
Well, the beginning, I think, represents really a rather unique relationship of my family and myself to Georgia Tech, because my grandfather was William Henry Emerson, who literally opened the doors at Georgia Tech in 1888 when they admitted in the fall their first group of students to the school. All of the preliminaries legally had been done. The incorporation had been a few years earlier, I think 1885, if my memory is right, and the building of the two major structures at Georgia Tech had occurred, and they were ready to go. And so in '88, they introduced their first students to the curriculum, which to me is very interesting, because I would like to challenge any viewer to honestly acknowledge that he knew what the first four studies at Georgia Tech were, which I'm now going to tell you.
Okay.
The first four courses at Georgia Tech were chemistry, as you might know because my grandfather was a chemist, physics, mathematics, and English.
No engineering.
Well, the students were not ready for engineering. They were, in those days, essentially all Georgia high school graduates, and they needed the training I just described long before they were ready to start any engineering work. And it was 3 years later when John Sailor Coon came to Georgia Tech to teach mechanical engineering. And as you know, that building is still there on Cherry Street. That was the first introduction of engineering into the curriculum at Georgia Tech. They did have another discipline, you might say. There was mechanical drawing. It was not a degree subject, but that was also available under an instructor. But the first four professors were chemistry, physics, mathematics, and English. And my grandfather being one of them, that's how I am related to Georgia Tech. He had come from a very interesting background, born in the hills of North Georgia, Tunnel Hill, Georgia. He had gone through what public schools they had there. He was born in 1860. And finally got an invitation, really, to go to the U.S. Naval Academy. And I'm sure there were politics involved in this, because his father was a representative in the House of Representatives of the legislature here in Georgia, and I'm almost certain that he had friends who, after the war, the Civil War, were able to get him the commission, really, to the Naval Academy. He graduated from there and then went on a 2-year round-the-world cruise with the Navy, and came back from that and entered Johns Hopkins University, where he studied chemistry, which was his love, under a famous chemist named Ira Remsen, R-E-M-S-E-N. And Ira Remsen had a tremendous influence on the university system in America. He had spent years in Germany studying chemistry there in various institutions, came back, was a year at Williams College in Massachusetts, then came to Baltimore and founded the Department of Chemistry there and created the American university system. of Central College with branches of various disciplines connected with it, and one, of course, was the Department of Chemistry there. And interestingly enough, Ira Remsen trained my grandfather, who came to Georgia Tech in 1888. He trained Charles Hurdy, who came 2 or 3 years later to the University of Georgia. And he trained J. Samuel Guy, who came to Emory University in 1916 and founded the Department of Chemistry there. So Ira Remsen trained the first 3 professional chemists, all in education, who came to the state of Georgia. Well, my grandfather did many things at Georgia Tech. He lived there in a home called the Dean's Home on the corner of McAfee Street and North Avenue. And every morning he would get up, have his breakfast, and walk across the street, across North Avenue, which was then pretty muddy, and into his office in the first big, now administration building, the only one left at Georgia Tech. And never owned an automobile in his entire life. He just walked to work and walked home, and when he wanted to go into Atlanta, he would walk up to Peachtree Street and catch what we call the trolley car in those days and ride into Atlanta. And I used to do the same as a student in public school, as I'll tell you later. But he, I think, truly had a profound influence on Georgia Tech because of his research, which he carried on. He published several seminal chemistry papers while he was most active in research and teaching. But he was renowned for his interest in the students and his desire to see his students succeed as professionals. So he always considered himself basically a teacher, which he was. And he worked for 36 years at Georgia Tech, going there essentially every day, even many days on Sunday, many weeks on Sunday. And it was 1924 in November that he finally died of heart congestion, brought on, I think, a little by his smoking habits, which were, he loved to smoke a pipe, and he had it with him continuously.
So you actually remember going to your grandfather's house and knowing him?
That's a good question. Thanks for the direction. Yes, my family at that time, or a good bit of that time, lived on North Avenue also, just east of Peachtree Street, and in an apartment called the Old Colonial Apartment. And on weekends we would go from there to his home, and that begins the story really of my life with Georgia Tech. And I'm coming back to it, but before I tell about it, I want to tell about William Henry Emerson's children, who were 2 sons, Cherry Logan Emerson, Sr., my father, and William Austin Emerson, Sr., who were born within 2 years of one another. My father in 1888, the year that my grandfather came to Atlanta, also in Tunnel Hill, Georgia, and he came down as an infant a few months later. His mother, Lily Cherry, brought him down. Lily Cherry is my grandmother, and that's how the name Cherry got into the family. It was common in the South then to name a son for both the mother and the father, the family names, and so that's how my father got to be named Cherry Emerson, and it's gone on down to me. William Austin Emerson was born in 1890, and he has a son, William Austin Emerson Jr., along with Boynton Emerson, and they are first cousins of mine. And although I have lost a little track of Boynton, although I know where he is. He works at the Social Security system as a lawyer in Washington. William Emerson Jr. is a very good friend and colleague of mine to this day. Mm-hmm. Well, let me tell you a little bit about what my father did at Georgia Tech and what my uncle did, for that matter, in Atlanta. It's easier to tell about William Austin Emerson. He graduated as an electrical engineer from Georgia Tech in 1911, I believe. You may want to check your record on that. I think that's right.
It says 1912, but...
All right, 1912 yeah. It is. And he soon thereafter went to work for Westinghouse Electric in Atlanta and stayed with them his entire career, and died in 1963, I believe. Again, check your records, having retired from Westinghouse. So that's a rather simple explanation. My father's life was a little more complex. He graduated both as a mechanical engineer, I believe, in 1908, and in 1910 as an electrical engineer. Maybe it was 10 and 9, but 1908.
We have 8 and 9.
All right, 8 and 9 it is. 8 as a mechanical engineer and 9 as an electrical engineer. And his first job, interestingly enough, was with Westinghouse Electric in Lynn, Massachusetts. And he worked for a year with them and definitely did not like the cold weather. And so he looked for another job and came to Duke Power in Charlotte, North Carolina. And that's where I really began there, biologically. Mm-hmm. And he worked with them until 1917. And having a good friend from Georgia Tech named Chip Robert, you probably have him already. Lawrence W. Robert Jr. he was. His father was senior, better known as Colonel Robert, or Lawrence Robert. The two had known one another, played football together at Georgia Tech, and Chip Robert decided in 1917 to start an engineering company in Atlanta, Georgia, where he would be, let's say, the chief mogul, but he needed a good engineer. So he called my father in Charlotte. I can't remember the telephone conversation. They were pretty difficult in those days, and I was 1 year old. And convinced him to come to Atlanta to be the vice president and chief engineer of Robert and Company. So in 1917, he came to Atlanta, bringing me against my will. I didn't want to go. And that was how I became an Atlantan at the age of 1, telling all my friends I'm a native Atlantan because that's much easier than the other story. And from 1917 until 1933, my father was the vice president and chief engineer of Robert and Company. At that time, Mr. Robert, as I always called him, was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Treasury by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and left Atlanta at that time essentially forever. Although he returned on visits, he never lived in Atlanta, to my knowledge, again, and certainly not for any length of time. And in 1933, my father became president of Robert and Company, and was president until 1945, at which time, at the invitation of Marion Luther Britton, who was the president of Georgia Tech, he came as vice president in charge of plant development, really, after World War II, to Georgia Tech. And he spent almost all the rest of his life at Georgia Tech as a dean, as a vice president of physical development of the plant. And for a short time after the death of Marion Luther Britton, he was involved in the selection committee for the new president, Blake Van Leer, who came to Georgia Tech, I guess, around 1947. You check your records again, but I met him briefly one time when they were looking for a new president. My only contact with Professor Van Leer. But he then went on to work as dean at Georgia Tech on the development of Georgia Tech Research Institute, GTRI. And as described in a book written by Robert McMath, a famous professor at Georgia Tech and historian, head of the Ivan Allen School of Business, International Affairs, and Social History Studies. Too many words. But Bob wrote a book of my grandfather's life. And in there he describes the founding of the Georgia Tech Research Institute, and the book is available in Georgia Tech libraries for anyone interested in that.
Are you referring to Engineering the New South, or is this a different book?
No, this is a book entitled William Henry Emerson and the Scientific Discipline at Georgia Tech, a story of my grandfather's life. Much better than I've told it so far. And in that book, which is on the chair over there, the little black book, he describes the accomplishments of my father as well. And that was what he thought was his greatest contribution to Georgia Tech. Although he held other positions, he was president of the Alumni Association of Georgia Tech. And he was always interested in the football team, and I'm going to tell a little bit about that as a result later on. Well, now I guess at that time, at that stage, I should get maybe to my history. But my father died in 1959, about a year and a half after he finally left Georgia Tech. He worked for that time as a consultant in an engineering firm here in Atlanta, and then died in October of 1959. So that completes fairly well the story of my grandfather's coming to Georgia Tech and the lives of my father and uncle. I'm going back now to my life as it impinged on that of my grandfather and some of those visits we made, and then I'll relate myself to Georgia Tech. I would go there, and I love my grandfather. He was a great influence on my life, even as a young child. And when I went there, he would always insist on teaching me something. It didn't really matter so much what he was, but he was a true teacher. And so one of the first things he decided to teach me were the mathematical tables. And I think probably as a result of that, I've been interested in mathematics, as I will demonstrate to you later in this interview. But I learned the mathematical tables before I ever went to school, which started with Spring Street Grammar School, which is now the Center of Puppetry Arts in Atlanta. But I just took it as a challenge to go home and learn how to present these mathematical tables. And so at the age of 6, I satisfied my mentor with my performance on the mathematical tables. He read there in the Dean's house at McAfee Street and North Avenue. He read to me the story of Treasure Island, as a young child, maybe 6 or 7 years old. And ever since then, I've related the Dean's House there to the Admiral Benbow Inn. Maybe you don't know that story too well. But the story of Treasure Island revolves initially around the Admiral Benbow Inn, where Jim Hawkins lived with his mother and father, and upstairs was the old captain with the peg leg, Long John Silver. No, well, Captain Billy Bones, I'm sorry, all you people have corrected me already. Captain Billy Bones lived upstairs, and Long John Silver came into the story later. But I made up this story of Treasure Island based on the Dean's House. And Blind Man Pugh come tapping his way around the corner of Fowler Street and North Avenue as he did in Treasure Island. You go read it, and you'll find that he left the black spot in the hand of Captain Billy Bones, which designated his death sentence. And all that occurred, whether you know it or not, right there in the Dean's House at Georgia Tech. Well, that story of Robert Louis Stevenson opened my eyes to literature and what effect it could have on a person. And I'm sure it too had a big influence on the many hundreds and hundreds of books I've read since then. And that was his teaching to me on that subject. But he taught me a lot of other things. He was an expert in the lore of the Cherokee Indians, and he taught me how to make a whistle out of hickory wood. You cut the hickory branch at the right time of year, the springtime, while there's still sap there. You cut off the right length, you notch it at the right place, you tap it with the back of your knife until the skin literally slides off of the branch, and then of the bark, I should say, and then you put in the little slot for the air to penetrate and to get out, and you have the notch there, and you put it all back together, and you've got a nice whistle. And that was the way the Cherokee Indians made their whistles, which were very famous in Indian lore. He taught me how to plant fruit trees in particular. He was interested in growing his own fruit there in the yard, and he had several fruit trees, and he would show me exactly how to put the seed in place, excavate the soil, this sort of thing. So his life, you see, with me, although I was only 8 approaching 9 when he died, his life with me was really as a mentor, and I've considered it so ever since. Well, he died, as I said, when I was a youngster, and I remember very well his memorial service in the old YMCA there, which is now where you work.
Right.
I don't know what they call the building now, but it was a religious chapel in those days for the students. And that was where his memorial service was held for Georgia Tech in late November, I think, of 1924.
Incidentally, the building is now called the Chip Robert Alumni House.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Well, that memorializes his name.
Right.
Well, that telephone we'll just let ring. To heck with him. Well, I went on to Spring Street Grammar School at the age of 6. And incidentally, I think I'm the only friend of Georgia Tech who ever flunked kindergarten, because my mother took me there at the age of 5, and the first day I was in kindergarten, they set me against the wall and gave me a long roll of about 2-inch wide colored tape, and just plain paper tape, and some LePage's glue and a pair of scissors, and they showed me how to cut the right length, put the LePage's glue on and form a little circle, and put the next one through it and make a daisy chain. And so I was pretty good, I guess, with my hands at that time. So I made a long, long daisy chain, and it got longer and longer, and I like to reminisce that I even threw it out of the window and kept making it. So finally I just got disgusted, and I threw down the scissors and the glue and the paper, and I said, let me out of here, and I wouldn't go back the next day. So my mother didn't like that, but I flunked kindergarten. But when I got into first grade, I took it seriously, and everything went all right from there. But I had good teachers there, and the education that I received from that day until I graduated from Boys High School in Atlanta, Georgia, was, I thought, exemplary. It was amazingly good. So I was kept next to O'Keefe Junior High School, where I went after graduating and getting a certificate from Spring Street Grammar School. I had lots of good teachers there. Mr. Wolf in the shop, the wood shop, who taught me how to use the basic tools, along with lots of other kids, of course. And to this day, I have a wood shop, which I work in and make a number of things I could show you right in this house. So that had an influence on me, but most of all, there was a Mr. Graham, who was a mathematics teacher at O'Keefe Junior High, and he could see that I liked math, going back to those math tables, and he used to challenge me with extra homework, and so I did it because I wasn't going to let this Mr. Graham get ahead of me. And so I would always come back, no matter what it took, with the extra homework done. So finally, he told my father that he thought I should get some instructions in mathematics, and he suggested Professor Smith, D.M. Smith, at Georgia Tech as a possible coach. And so for a solid year, and my last year there at O'Keefe Junior High, on Wednesday afternoons, I would leave O'Keefe Junior High and march down to the old administration building at Georgia Tech, find Professor Smith, and he and I would study together mathematics. And he led me even into calculus before I got to Boys High School. And I was no Einstein at math, let's get that clear, but I love math, and he pushed me as far as he thought he could. And it had a very good influence on my life. And I learned lots of stories from that man. He had a wonderful sense of humor, Professor Smith, and he and I just sort of reacted together naturally. And I give him a lot of credit, but for my mathematical training. But it got me so far ahead of what went on at Boys High in mathematics, not anything else, that the math at Boys High was rather a boring subject, and it was not until I got to Emory University, where, as I said, I had a major in math. I took every course that Emory had to offer in math, that I, again, got truly interested in the subject. But I guess I'm being told we...
Tell us something about Dr. D.M. Smith.
Well, as I said, I studied under him and became aware of a wonderful story of his that I can't guarantee he told to me, but he's told it so that it's become a real part of Georgia Tech history, and I'll repeat it now just to make sure you have it on the record. Well, in 1928, Georgia Tech had a wonderful football team. It went to the Rose Bowl and played there in January 1 of 1929. And therein occurred that wrong way Roy Regal run Stumpy Thomason, the halfback, fumbled that ball, and I heard it on radio. And Roy Riegel picked it up and ran the wrong way, and Georgia Tech ended up winning the game 8-7 and came back to major headlines in the Atlanta Journal, national champions, jackets proclaimed national champions. Well, that was the era in which this story developed. Now, Stumpy Thomason was a good halfback, but he was not the world's best student. But that team had a center named Peter Pund, who was an All-American football center and a wonderful person and a very good scholar. And both Stumpy Thompson and Peter Pund were in the same mathematics class of Professor D.M. Smith. So they had the same instruction. And time came for the final examination, and Stumpy Thomason sat right behind Peter Pund in working out the examination. And it was 10 questions. And Peter Pund answered the first 8 questions. He looked carefully at number 9 for quite a while and wrote down for his answer to number 9, "I do not know the answer to this question." And he went on and did number 10, and he got all 9 right, other than question number 9. And so when Professor Smith came back a couple of weeks later to review the results with the students, he said, "Peter Pund, A, you got 9 out of 10, that's good for an A." And finally he got down to Stumpy Thomason's name. He said, "Stumpy, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to flunk you." And Stumpy said, "Well, you said what Peter Pund got there on those 9 questions, and I got the same answers." And he said, "Mere fact that I didn't get number 9 either, that could be just a coincidence." And Professor Smith said, "Yes, Stumpy, I would have to agree with you except for one thing. When you answered question number 9, you wrote down, 'I don't neither.'" And so that story is ingrained now in the lore of Georgia Tech. And I dare say it's true. But I can't remember whether I learned that directly from Professor Smith. I'm making no such claim, but I've certainly got it in my head, and so I thought I'd tell you that. Well, at Boys High, I had a reasonably good 3 years. Academically, I graduated 4th in the class, and went on to Emory University because I had asked around. I was interested in chemistry. Oh, by the way, I've forgotten to tell you one of my best stories as to why I became interested in chemistry in the first place. And it goes back to my grandfather's house, again, there on McAfee Street and North Avenue. On one of my visits there, I created a little diversion. My grandmother had an old iron stove. It was flat on top, and it had removable sections if you wanted to turn the gas heat on and cook on it, and removable covers, round covers. So she kept the whole thing covered with newspaper, and it would drape over the edges, and you can almost imagine the rest. I got interested in what would happen to that newspaper if I were to light it with a match. And I found out pretty quickly I did just that, and the paper flamed up, and I can just remember now the flames rising over that kitchen stove. I knew things weren't as they should be, so I made some noise, and my grandfather walked into the kitchen, and he saw in an instant what was going on, so he just walked over to the towel rack and came back with a towel and gently laid it down on the burning newspaper, and the flames went out like that. To me, that was magic. It still is in a way. And then instead of giving me a whooping, he explained to me exactly what had happened when I lit the fire and it raised the temperature of the paper so that the oxygen from the air burned it, and that all he had to do in order to stop it was to cover the paper and exclude the oxygen, which was what was keeping the fire going. And so I made a little mental note that if this is chemistry, I want to know some more about it. And that truly is, that's an absolutely truthful story, and that truly is one of the basic steps in my interest in chemistry. So when I got ready for college, my father, of course, wanted me to go to Georgia Tech, but I did not go because I had found that J. Sam Guy at Emory had a great reputation as a teacher of chemistry, and that was what I wanted to study. So I did go to Emory, and that begins now a whole new part of my life. I studied there for 4 years and got a Bachelor of Arts degree from Emory with a major in both chemistry and mathematics. And then I got a teaching assistant to the Professor Osborne R. Quayle, the head of the organic section of the chemistry department. J. Sam Guy was head of the entire chemistry department. And I taught the organic chemistry lab there in my graduate year. And I had a student whom I got reacquainted with literally only 1 year ago before this interview. Harold Johnston is his name, and he is one of America's famous chemists. He went on to get his doctorate after my instructions in the lab at, I guess it was Harvard. I'll have to ask Harold. And then he went on to Berkeley, and he's still a professor of chemistry at Berkeley, although I dare say it's emeritus now. But he was one of the true students of the Earth's atmosphere and all of the reactions of the components of the atmosphere. And the U.S. government depended upon his studies for many of their insights into what happens when you have an atomic explosion and all that sort of thing. And only about a year ago, Emory University brought Harold Johnston back as a lecturer. And actually in a lecture seminar series which I had the privilege of instituting some years before that. Well, he came back and looked at me, and I looked at him, and I said, I know you, and he said, I know you. And so, of course, it developed that in my teaching assistantship, Harold Johnston was one of my students in the chemistry lab. He was 1 year behind me. And so we had a great reunion at Emory during that occasion, and have kept in touch by letter since then. So when I want to really impress someone about my ability in chemistry, I tell them, well, my student was Harold Johnston. It's certainly true, but it has no relation. He is, to what I said, he is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a man of very, very high repute in the field of chemistry. And I take my hat off to Harold Johnston. But he was, for a short while, my student. But when I graduated finally with a Master of Arts, with also a major in chemistry, and a major in mathematics. I took every math course that Emory University had to offer. I got a scholarship to Johns Hopkins University to proceed with further study in chemistry. And that arose primarily because in that graduate year, there were about 6 of us at Emory University. Dr. Quayle, whom I've mentioned previously, got a consultant from Johns Hopkins, a professor of organic chemistry named E. Emmett Reed, R-E-I-D, to come to Emory University and supervise the graduate theses. And so I had the opportunity to work for the first time in my life with a famous person, you might say, from outside of the Atlanta area, well known in the field I was interested in. And incidentally, the man who wrote a book entitled The First 100 Years, and which he described his life and his involvement in chemistry, and promised in the last paragraph that he was going to write the second 100 years as soon as he could. He didn't reach that. He reached 104. And so that proves that chemistry can keep you healthy, I guess. Well, anyway, that relationship developed into this scholarship that I had. And at this point, I can answer a question which you asked me off the record early on, why I didn't go to Georgia Tech and why I went to MIT. Well, my father at that point wanted me now to go to Georgia Tech and study engineering. He wanted me to be an engineer, and incidentally I am. But I told him, look, I've got this scholarship, it was called then, to Johns Hopkins University, and it's worth $1,000, and it'll put me through the first year there, and then I'm on my own. But I can probably make out, and so I think I'd better follow that path. Well, he was persistent, and finally, after a few months, I said, well, all right, I'll tell you what I will do. I'll promise to study chemical engineering as an engineering discipline. But 2 things. Number 1, I want you to tell me what the best school of chemical engineering in America is. And of course he had wanted me, as I said, to go to Georgia Tech. And he finally had to admit MIT has got the best school of chemical engineering today, and that, by the way, was 1939. Well, I said, okay, I then will go to MIT if you will support me for the first year, because I have this $1,000 scholarship I've got to give up to Johns Hopkins. See, I was bargaining. And he said, all right, I'll support you for 1 year and then you're on your own. And so I applied to MIT and did a lot of paperwork and so on, and finally I got admitted to MIT and went there. And in the next couple of years, I earned a Master of Science from MIT, that degree. And that was, you might say, the completion of my formal education. But lots of things happened to me at MIT. And number 1, my major professor became Warren Kimball Lewis, who was arguably one of the founders of modern chemical engineering in America. And he was my thesis supervisor. And so I got to know him well, and he certainly is one of the men who influenced my life very, very markedly. And not only that, but he had a beautiful daughter named Mary Kimball Lewis. And her portrait hangs behind you. I'm looking at it from here, so I'm inspired. And I met her one day when she walked into his office when he was berating me over some mistake I had made in chemical engineering, trying to straighten me out. He played a teacher-student role with almost every student of his, the true Socratic method. He would never let you make any kind of a fundamental mistake or even approaching it without sitting you down and going it over that whole problem step by step until you had the right idea. He was a true teacher, as well as my grandfather. Well, anyway, I met Mary, and Dr. Lewis, Professor Lewis, had a scheme of inviting graduate students to live at his home in Newton, Massachusetts. And these students had very well-defined duties. They had to stoke the furnace in the morning. They had to bank the furnace at night. It was a coal-fired furnace. They had to be ready to help Mrs. Lewis with any task that she might have that they could help with, taking her somewhere if she had an important meeting, and bringing her back, of course, and generally being the maitre d' of the household, performing all kinds of menial duties as well as important ones. And I was preceded by, and well, not followed by, as I started to say, but I was preceded by a number of excellent students of his. I was about the fifth in line, I guess, and he invited me to come and live with their family there in Newton. And of course, this was a wonderful opportunity, more ways than one. And I accepted, and I went there, and I lived there for my second year at MIT. And I also received for my second year at MIT a stipend from the DIC, Division of Industrial Cooperation at MIT, which was a consortium of businesses that supported research in various engineering disciplines at MIT. And one of those companies was Esso at the time, now Exxon. But Esso supported my thesis, and I worked, interestingly enough, on the chemical purification of adipalgus clay for catalytic use in oil refining. Do you know where Adipalgus is? No. Adipalgus is a town in the southwest corner of the state of Georgia. So I think someone gave a little thought to that one. But anyway, I had modest success at the thesis and was given a Master of Science degree. But far more important in my life, I had found Mary. And in 1941 we were engaged, and in 1942, September 10 at 4 p.m. in Elliott Church in Newton, we were married. And so you might say that my rewards for giving up that scholarship at Johns Hopkins and going to MIT were rather profound. And I always think of the turn of the wheel of fate when I tell that story. So it was the best possible outcome.
And very convenient to be living with her family.
Yes, very convenient.
Yeah.
And I haven't mentioned one of my avocations, which is music, but I'll probably get to that later on here, if you can last that long.
Sure.
And my first date with Mary Lewis was in Boston Symphony Hall, where I took her to hear the orchestra, then under the direction of Serge Koussevitzky. You don't know that name, but you should study it a little bit. He was probably Boston's most famous orchestral conductor of all time, Serge Koussevitzky. from Russia. But anyhow, we developed an interest in music together, which still exists here, and I'll tell you more about that. But I think you would like to hear maybe just a little bit about my professional work.
Sure.
And right after, the day after I finished work at MIT, I went to work for Monsanto Chemical Company in Springfield, Massachusetts. I got on the train with all of my belongings and rode out there and found a place to live and went to work within 2 days.
So this was before you were married?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. I graduated in '41. Maybe I didn't say that. We were engaged that year, but we were married a year later. So I was well at work, saved up a lot of money, and spent it all about a week after we were married on furniture for the little apartment we had. But I worked in total in Springfield and later in Boston, actually Everett, Massachusetts. And that brings up a story I'm just going to tell. Everett, Massachusetts is named for Edward Everett, who was one of its famous citizens, and incidentally had a small part in the founding of MIT. But Edward Everett delivered the Gettysburg Address. You're startled, which is good. That was the intention. But his address there, and he was a famous orator at the Gettysburg convening of that group, lasted over 2 hours. And therein lies a good lesson for you. The newspapers next day reported how Edward Everett delivered this impassioned address at Gettysburg, and the president said a few words. And of course, those few words are the Gettysburg Address. And what Edward Everett had to say is long forgotten. So 2 hours is no substitute for 2 minutes of real intelligent effort. But I thought you'd like to know that, so just remember it. Edward Everett delivered the Gettysburg Address, and the president said a few words. Well, anyway, I worked at Everett, Massachusetts, and after 7 years with Monsanto and throughout the war, I was engaged in war work and technical war work. After that time, Bill Cumming, who was actually in the U.S. Navy during World War II, and a radar officer on the Gambia Bay small carrier ship, he came back. He had worked at Monsanto with me, and we decided that this was not our cup of tea, that we wanted to start our own business and do our own thing. He was a mechanical engineer from Stevens. That was the only degree they gave. And I was a chemical engineer from MIT. So we got together and formed Emerson and Cumming. And it was extremely fortuitous as to timing, because epoxy resins, you know the phrase, I'm sure, epoxy resins were just becoming known in America, and Shell Chemical was actively at work at Emeryville, California on this major chemical product. And there was a person, Don Wells. I hope Don gets to hear some of this. He lives still in Atlanta and founded Magnolia Chemical, which is still up on Peachtree Industrial Boulevard right now while we're talking. Don Wells worked with us at Monsanto and Everett and left there about the same time we did and went to Shell at Emeryville. And so one day while we were in our office on the corner of Commonwealth and Massachusetts Avenue in Boston, trying to think up ways to have projects to make some money and a living, into the office walked Don Wells. And he threw up his arms and he said, "Fellas, I'm going to make you rich." And he was right. He introduced us to shells, epoxy resins, and we took them over and began to try formulations in the laboratory, and soon thereafter we had them in commerce. And our first major customer was General Electric in Pittsfield, and as far as I know, to this day, they're still buying that stuff from Emerson and Cumming, which is now, as of long ago, 18 years, a division of W.R. Grace and Company. But that's how we got started, primarily, although we did some really great individual research efforts based on all kinds of activities going around in Boston. And I'll just give you an insight into that sort of activity by telling you about one of them, which had to do with the Harvard Medical School and its Department of Chemistry, and Edwin J. Cohn, C-O-H-N, Dr. Cohn, and he was regarded by everybody as this medical genius at Harvard, and he was a chemist. His doctorate was in chemistry. And he nevertheless did wonderful work really for America. He was the first one to separate plasma from blood cells, the white cells, red cells, and platelets, and make that plasma available as a transfusion material that saved thousands of lives in World War II. And then he had this wonderful idea that best described this way, that he was going to separate every element of the blood, bottle it, vacuum dry it, set it on the shelf, and this included the cells as well as the protein fractions of the plasma. And so when you wanted whole blood, you would simply put the right proportion of these matters into distilled water and stir it up, and you've got human blood. The concept was truly awesome for those days, but it never came to pass, and I sort of think it may never come to pass. But he made a real sincere effort at it, and in order to execute it, he needed somebody to create equipment for him so he could go through the various processes necessary to do that. And he went over to MIT and asked them, did they know of any bright young people? Those were his two words, bright young people, who could help him in this. And so, thank heavens, they suggested, well, maybe you should call Cherry Emerson and talk to him. And he did. And so I had a call from him. We went to work for them, and I'll tell you more about this in just a minute. Well, just to finish that story about our relation with Harvard Medical School, which really did set us on a path to success, you might say, or stabilized us financially, I guess is a better way to say it. We spent 2.5 years thereafter working for Dr. Cohn's group, and we brought in as the key element the material Teflon, which in those days, this was 1949, in those days was just a research item on the shelves at DuPont Chemical. Was not in commercial use anywhere. And we realized, as we had been told, that the cellular components of blood will be destroyed if they are brought into contact with any physical force on a metallic surface. And so there had to be some other surface that was highly hydrophobic and would treat the cells nicely. So we manufactured, for the first time in history, a centrifuge lined on the inside with solid Teflon. We put a rod into a tube, machined it out, and made the surface that we wanted inside. And that became the real winner in the separation of live, healthy blood cells from the blood plasma. And I remember one day when we were over at the Harvard Med School and working on the problem of separating platelets, which are a small component of the blood, volume-wise, but a very important one, as you know, I'm sure, because of the way in which it helps to resist disease in particular. And for the first time in human history, we were able to separate live platelets from human blood. And the doctor working on it, we were just manipulating the equipment. We were the mechanics, and he was the brains. And when we got those platelets out, he said, "My God, they're alive." And that was it for platelets. That was the beginning for live platelets. Well, we did that sort of work for 2.5 years, invented all kinds of machinery to help that process along. And well, I'm going to tell the rest of the story because I don't know how to beat around the bush. I've heard Dr. Cohn say, "I should have won the Nobel Prize." And I think he should have too, because of all those lives he saved with his plasma transfusion in World War II. But the man did not have a friend. He was irascible, he was arrogant, and of course he was brilliant. But you need a friend to get the Nobel Prize, and he could not find anyone who wanted to back him because he had irritated probably everyone he ever came in contact with. So use that as a lesson too. You be nice to people, they're nice to you. And he never got that lesson, so he probably lost the Nobel Prize because of that. Well, anyway, all that time we were frantically developing epoxy resins, and we'd had enough success, so we had to move to a plant from just an office and laboratory in Boston, and we moved out to Canton, Massachusetts, bought an old plant there, the home plant of the Rising Sun stove polish. That'll give you an idea of when that plant was built. The black iron, black-bellied stoves, you know, and you polished them up with this wax that they made them look good. Maybe my grandmother's stove was like that. And we soon expanded out of that plant into another one in Canton. And we got into various other projects. I'll just skim the surface because when we turned the business over to W.R. Grace in 1978, we had about 450 products. Some winners, some just get along, some pretty good. But I can't possibly describe all of that. But two other things might interest your listeners, I hope so. I don't want to bore anybody. We invented micro balloons, and that means tiny spherical plastic objects that are hollow. That's why they are balloons. They weigh very lightweight. And we were able finally to make them out of all kinds of plastic materials, but the one that's of most interest is glass. You, I'm sure, know that glass is a plastic, and many people don't. I'm glad you say yes. And we were able to build a furnace and have a glass formulation to feed into that furnace, which had within it a so-called blowing agent, so that when you heated these tiny particles of glass, which we had created as ground up material, it would expand into a sphere. That was the only way it could go. And so it had a hollow center and a very strong, because it was spherical, very strong glass wall. And those became very important in the oil well drilling industry as a material to incorporate an epoxy resin to provide buoyancy for underwater parts of the oil well drilling system. I don't know whether I should tell about that or not, but I will. I'll be very brief. It's going to irritate some people to hear this brief story. But when you drill for oil, you have to use so-called mud, a mixture basically of clay and glycerin, to pump down a pipe, which is the grinding bit, and wash the bit out and cool it. And you have to recycle that mud because it's relatively expensive. And you have to bring it back into the system. Well, what do you do when you're drilling on the top of the ocean? Well, the answer, to be brief, is first you pour concrete on the ocean floor, and then you set a blowout preventer in that. And then you bring down a pipe from the drill rig, a big pipe, 36-inch diameter, just to use a number, but a thick steel wall. And the drill pipe goes down through it. Your 4 or 5-inch drill pipe is in the annulus of this pipe. So the way you do it is you pump the mud the same way, and you bring it back up through the blowout preventer and up through the riser pipe, as it's called, the big pipe. Now you have this large volume of mud coming up, and so you need a strong steel tube called a riser tube, a riser pipe. And it's so heavy that it will distort the operation of the rig up on the surface. It'll move it around with the ocean currents, and it's impractical to have that, particularly with a deep water drilling system. So we devised these collars that would strap around the outside of the riser pipe. These collars were a plastic formulation of epoxy and glass microballoons, with which it was possible to completely to design the weight completely out of that system. The riser pipe had enough buoyancy strapped to the pipe, so the weight was of no consideration. Finally, it was found that 95% was about right, so it's now a system that's used in all underwater drilling operations for oil. Well, that was important industrially and for us financially. But the major use for glass microballoons that you might say was of importance to the world and was this. It's possible to treat glass with hydrochloric acid and convert it to quartz. I know you know this. And we found that if you then incorporate these quartz microballoons into a silicone resin, that you have a material which can withstand very high temperature, very lightweight. And what would you do with that? Well, I'll tell you, because if I could dig that out of you, I'm sure, with a better explanation.
Maybe.
But yes, I could. But what happened was that these quartz microballoons, our first big order, I'll give you a hint, was from NASA in Houston, Texas. And we didn't know what they wanted with them, but of course we provided them. And we provided them for years with quartz microballoons without any knowledge of what they were doing. And all that time they were testing to find out whether or not these could be the basic component of the heat shield. And sure enough, it came to pass that that's what happened. The quartz microballoons are, to this day, the basic ingredient of the NASA heat shield. So that was a very, shall we call it, meritorious, notorious.
Quite an accomplishment.
Idea, but it didn't do much for us financially because there are just not many of those heat shield items needed. But the way in which it became important, the glass for oil well. Well, that was one of our materials, buoyancy, underwater buoyancy materials, and it turned out to be good. It's still around, very importantly, in industry. And the other was microwave absorbers. Now, you've heard of microwaves, like microwave stoves and all that, and there's a tube in that microwave oven, S-band tube it's called, which will create the energy for cooking. And that's very high frequency material. S-band is about, well, let's just call it 2.5 megahertz. There's a band width that goes both ways from there, but that's 2.5 million cycles per second. And so I just thought that would be an interesting number for you to keep in your mind. It's very, very, very high frequency stuff. But these microwaves are easy to generate, but they sometimes come back to haunt you in many industrial applications. And it's really the basis for radar searching for aeroplanes. You turn an antenna on and look at an airplane and you will get a return from it. The antenna can pick, the same antenna can pick that up. And now you can identify this object in the sky or on the ground or wherever. It's widely used for telephone service now, the microwave antennas for telephone use, transmission. And so it's a very important thing in industry. But there are times when you want to get rid of these return objects, rays. And particularly so when you've got aeroplanes in the sky you don't want other people to see. And so that will give you, obviously I can see that you understand this. We had a lot of work in the stealth program, which was to help hide aeroplanes or other objects in the sky, for that matter, from radar search, so that they did not reflect the radar beam to the antenna. And that was important, again, like the NASA thing, but it did not create much of an income either. The research element of that was the big thing. We worked for 25 years for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base on the research elements of that program. But aside from that, we never had any contribution to the industrial production. That was taken over by the aircraft companies themselves. But the microwave absorbers became a big product of ours in what is known as RF shielded microwave anechoic chambers. Those are a lot of words, but the key word is anechoic, and anechoic is a Greek word meaning no echoes. So you have this chamber, can be very large, much larger than this house we're in, lined with microwave absorbers, so that if you turn an antenna on in there, you get no reflections from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and you have essentially a situation, you might say, similar to a space situation where you can broadcast without any reflections because there's nothing out there to reflect. And these rooms became the place for, the chosen place, you might say, for ground-based testing of all kinds of antenna systems, aircraft, whole aircraft put into these chambers. That can give you an idea of the size of them. And then all of the antennas are fired up, as they say, turned on, and you are able to see the interrelations of the antenna systems to one another. You're able to test them one by one and see that they work properly as though they were in outer space, which is where they have to work. So these chambers, microwave anechoic chambers, became a good part of our business, and that was a lot of engineering, design, and testing, and so on. So that, in brief, is what I spent my professional career at. And I think I've thereby covered most of the technical aspects, but I do want to bring into this subject the life of Alfredo Barilli, who was my professor of music as a youngster from the age of 14. I studied with him from 14 to 18, so I was 2 years almost into Emory at the time. I was 2 years into Emory. And he was a big influence on my life because I agree with William Barton Rogers, the founder of MIT, that the arts are an indispensable part of a technical education. And I hope somebody at Georgia Tech hears that one, because it is so. And a true engineer without any appreciation of the arts is a lost man. It has to be there. And so he provided a very important element of the arts in my life, and it's still with me, and it's still in the family. And that piano right there by your left elbow was selected for me by Alfredo Barilli, and if you want to know how I came to own that piano, I refer you to that new book, Alfredo Barilli and the Rise of Classical Music in Atlanta, authored by N. Lee Orr of Georgia State University. And it's a wonderful book, and it tells the story of how in 1880 Alfredo Barilli came here as a 26-year-old man, and the contributions he made to music in Atlanta, which were profound. He was born in Florence, Italy in 1854, and it's amazing, but I studied under him in 1931 through 35, and he had previously been a friend of my maternal grandmother's family, the White family here in Atlanta. So I think that was why he took me on. I was no great musician, but I loved music and I wanted to play well. And he taught me a lot of musical lore. He taught me a lot of things about music that I never would have learned from a piano teacher. And he gave me basic piano instruction as well. So I'm going to make sure that that book gets into the Georgia Tech Library. And,
so was he also a performer in addition to,
yes,
to teaching?
He certainly was. He was a wonderful pianist. He played for example, Brahms, who gave him a big kiss and told him he was going to be one of the best. And he was a performer in Philadelphia, and New York, and Atlanta as well. He created the Polymnia Club, a woman's chorus here in Atlanta, a 60 or 80 voice chorus that lasted throughout his life and longer. But he did much more than that. It's in the book. He had the first in 1883, only 3 years after he got here. He organized and put on the first music festival in Atlanta's history, and it was a big success. And he went on to form the Barilli School of Music, and his wife, Emily Barilli, née Vezin, as she liked to say. The Vezin was a French name, her family's name, and they were a very artistic group all in themselves. Two of her brothers were members of the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and she herself was a fine musician and pianist, so they made a tremendous impact on the life of Atlanta, and I think I wanted so much to say something about them. Very important in my life. The three most important men in my life were my grandfather, Alfredo Barilli, and Warren K. Lewis, Mary's father, with whom I spent countless hours arguing this and that. We loved to argue together. Any subject you wanted to name. And Dr. Lewis, in 1949, wrote a truly seminal report to the faculty and administration of MIT to cover the next 50 years, which is almost done. And I think MIT is about to start on a similar report to cover the next 50 years. And one of the persons, interestingly enough, working on that report is Rosalind Williams, who is a niece of Mary Lewis Emerson, his great-granddaughter. So it's still in the family, you
good.
might say. Well, I remember so well talking with him. I can't tell this story, it would last for hours, about our debates on what an engineering education ought to be like. And I thought, of course, from my experience, that 5 years was right, 4 years was wrong. And I think he thought that too, although he was careful never to commit himself to anything. It was always, in his view, a committee decision. And he always went along with the majority. And that report I referred to of his stuck with the 4-year engineering education. But I truly think that he thought 5 years was about right too. And although he had no great love of the arts, he felt that the arts were necessary in an engineering education as well. So we had some agreement there.
That's good.
Good, yes. Well, I think that about winds up what I have to say.
I have a couple more questions.
Yes.
Tell us what you've been doing since you retired.
I haven't retired.
Oh.
I've just shifted gears.
I see. Well, what have you been doing lately?
Well, I'm involved in many things at Emory University. And one of the things does, in truth, go back to my mathematical training as a youngster. I got very interested in what computers could do for chemistry, because that's my basic discipline, and was able to establish a supercomputer center for studies of theoretical chemistry at Emory University, and to endow a chair there, which is the first recipient of which was, or is, Keiji Murakuma, a Japanese scientist who studied under a Nobel laureate in theoretical molecular chemistry. Came to the United States, and he taught for many years at Rochester University, and then came to Emory to found that theoretical chemistry department, which is here. So that was a major effort. And as I briefly mentioned, I was able to initiate a seminar series in chemistry, which is still going on and has been expanded well beyond my initial scope, because Emory University now brings at least 100 renowned scientists every year to the Department of Chemistry for seminar lectures. And that has had profound influence, I think, on the teaching of chemistry at Emory. So that was, it's very rewarding to me to be able to look on that and see how much good it's done there. And then Mary and I are both proponents of the arts, and so we're involved in musical efforts in Atlanta. And maybe you know, you seem to know a lot about me when you came in here. One of my favorite activities is with the Atlanta Chamber Players, and a musical group, really very excellent group now. And Paula Peace is the founder and the pianist, and they have a violinist now. They have a wonderful group of musicians today. We had to go through some tough times, but a violinist, Christopher Pilgrim, who studied under Yehudi Menuhin. Do you know that name? No. No. Well, you go learn it. He is still today. He's still alive. He's my age. You know, almost senile. And he's still very, very active in music as a conductor now. But he was one of the great violinists of the first half of this century. And I've heard him in concert in Atlanta as a youngster. But our violinist studied with him, and we have a fine cellist, two of them as a matter of fact, that alternate, and the group expands when it needs to put on something like the Mendelssohn sextet, and it contracts when it's only a trio. And each year they put on a number of very fine performances in the field of chamber music. And I am a director on the symphony. They call it a board of directors. It isn't, and I'm glad to put it on the record. It's a board of sponsors. It has an executive committee, which are the directors of maybe 6 or 8 people, I don't really know. But the board of directors is sincerely interested in the symphony and wants in many ways to help it, and does. But it's not a directorship in the sense of a decision-making body. But I'm on that board, and I am involved as deeply as I can get involved with music. Whenever I find some avenue, I walk down it a ways and see what happens.
Sounds good.
But those are my chief activities, Emory and music.
One other area we haven't talked about is the future of the Emerson family. Tell us about your children and grandchildren.
Well, that does get... you sure you have enough time? Well, I'll tell you in very brief outline. We have 6 children, 3 daughters and 3 sons. And after this interview is over, I'm going to show you, hanging here in our home, a portrait of the 3 daughters. It's very near you, within 30 feet, but you haven't seen it. And of the 3 daughters, one, our middle daughter Catherine, who lives in Atlanta, is an accountant, and has worked a good part of her life after graduation from Emory in the Atlanta area. The oldest daughter, Mary, named for her mother, is a social worker involved in all kinds of teaching and social activities in Jacksonville. Well, Mary has 3 children. They're all daughters, One is a mathematician, runs in the family. Our oldest daughter, Heather, and she is working in the field of applied math as it impinges on industrial operations of plants and processes. And the middle daughter is Laura. We have several Lauras in the family, and she is in television work. She's in Norfolk, Virginia, and is a producer of television shows for the local network there in Norfolk. And the youngest is Stacy, who is still in college at the University of Florida, working now on a PhD in sociology. And she already has a master's, I'm pretty sure. And Heather, the oldest, has a master in mathematics from Florida State, and Laura has a master's from the University of Gainesville in in TV and related production schemes. You can see I don't have the exact right words for it, but that is Mary's side of the story, our daughter Mary. And our daughter Laura, by the way, I didn't say Mary has also a master's degree from the University of Florida, our daughter Mary, so they seem to center around the University of Florida. Our youngest daughter, Laura, went to Mount Holyoke after she grew up in Duxbury, Massachusetts, where we lived while I was working in Canton. And then later went to Stanford and finished her undergraduate work there. Later went to John Kennedy University, maybe you've heard of it, in the hills of the Sierras there, and got a master's degree in social work also, and later established an office she has a clientele that I sort of related to psychiatric work, but she's not a psychiatrist, she's not an MD. She married Peter Dunn, also a New Englander, who still works in bank finance area in Oakland, California. And he works in San Francisco, they live in Oakland. And they have two children, grandchildren of ours, of course, Kyla and Nathan. Kyla is a graduate of Yale and now is working on a Hughes Fellowship at UCSF in neurobiology. And Nathan is an engineering graduate of Stanford and working in the Chicago area with a large engineering company there. And I didn't mention Catherine's daughter, Krista, who is our other grandchild, you might say, on the feminine side of our daughters. And Krista is working in architecture here in Atlanta. I think you're the mechanic, you're architecture, yeah, right. Well, that briefly covers the girls. And our sons, the oldest is Bill William. And that brings me back to something I simply forgot. His middle name is Clay, William Clay Emerson. He is named for my Mary's brother. Did I tell you about Herbert Clay Lewis? I don't think so. But Herbert Clay Lewis is Mary's brother and my brother-in-law. He's a chemical engineer. He went to Carnegie Tech, it was in those days, for his doctorate in chemical engineering, taught for a while at the University of Illinois, and then came to Georgia Tech. So Mary's brother and my brother-in-law taught chemical engineering at Georgia Tech for 37 years. And he died only a couple of years ago and lived for all of that time, most of that time, in Decatur, where his widow still lives.
Yet another tech connection.
That's another tech connection, and it comes right out of MIT.
Right.
Clay Lewis, as he liked to be called, was the son, of course, of Warren Kimball Lewis, Mary's brother. And he probably learned more from his father than I did, but they were very close. And Clay had a very, very wonderful career in teaching in chemistry, chemical engineering, sorry. He was acknowledged as one of the real fine teachers in chemical engineering. And at Georgia Tech, you mentioned Clay Lewis, and you will get an immediate response. So there is an intertwining of the families that really is rather remarkable. But William Clay Emerson is our oldest son, and he's a graduate of Worcester Polytechnical Institute in both mechanical and civil engineering. And his career has been mainly as a home builder, house builder, up in Massachusetts. Our middle son, Warren Kimball Emerson, he has his grandfather's name, is a graduate of George Washington University in economics, and before that, not Haverford, it's a big competition, I'll have to think, but he got both a bachelor's degree in economics and then a master's degree from George Washington University. And he actually worked for Barry Bosworth, one of Jimmy Carter's economic advisors. Warren was in his office. And since then, has been in the journalist field, the field of journalism. Which reminds me that I didn't tell you about my first cousin, Bill Emerson's career in journalism. Boynton I told you about as a lawyer, but William Austin Emerson Jr. Was in the field of journalism after his graduation from first Davidson and then Harvard, and as an editor of the Saturday Evening Post. And after that, at the University of South Carolina as a professor of journalism there until he retired and came to Atlanta, where he's now in publications of all kinds, really. So back now to the boys. The third one is Edwin Logan Emerson. He's got my middle name. And Edwin is a graduate of MIT in mechanical engineering. And after working for General Electric for a while and Scientific Atlanta, here in Atlanta, where our grandson, Edwin Logan Emerson Jr. was born. So we have a native Atlantan grandson. After that, Ned went back to Massachusetts and has formed his own engineering company there, and he's a consultant to a number of companies in all sorts of engineering activities related to process control, which in turn is computer controlled. And he's an expert in use and application of computers to industrial equipment, all kinds of mechanical equipment, and is making somewhat of a name for himself in that field in Massachusetts. Well, I think that really should finish it.
That's interesting that there were
there
were no more Georgia Tech graduates on your side of the family.
That is a good point, but we, you see, were living all that time in Massachusetts. And the boys grew up in Massachusetts, and they knew the culture, you might say, and the availability of education in that area much better than they did here. And I never tried to influence any one of them any more than to answer questions. For example, Ned needed, his mother actually their mother gave more help to them, I think, in college selection than I did. But I let them roam freely mentally in that field. I didn't want to say, like my father said to me, you should go to Georgia Tech. I didn't like that particularly, and I don't, so I never did it. But their mother gave them a lot of good advice in that field. And there's so many good schools up there, you know, that it's easy to associate yourself with one.
Well, thank you so much for making this contribution to Georgia Tech.
Well, you're welcome. I hope it's not too long.
No, no, it's wonderful.
Sure.